This is Audible.
Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Insulin, A 100-Year History by Stuart Bradwell. Narrated by Michael Langan. Preface. For the first 2 decades of my life, I gave little thought to diabetes and much less to insulin, the medication used to treat it. What little I did know about the subject came from the media and occasional comments from friends and family members. I had already left school before I met someone who had been touched by the condition, or, more likely, someone who openly discussed it. As a teenager, I spent some time working in a small charity bookshop in Newcastle upon Tyne. One day, one of my older colleagues arrived for his shift ashen-faced. He had, he said, been diagnosed with diabetes, and the news had left him, a man in his 40s, visibly shaken. At the time, I did not know what to say. Watching him struggle to adapt to his new life, wincing as he performed insulin injections in the break room, seemed only to confirm what I had learned from sensationalist headlines and bleak fictional portrayals. Diabetes seemed terrifying. It scared me, and I could not imagine how I would react were it to happen to me. As it turned out, I was closer than I would have liked to finding out. As a child, I was asthmatic, and even though the condition had become much milder by my late teens, I still attended routine review appointments for it. In 2009, my GP surgery mistakenly sent out the wrong form with my clinic invitation letter. It asked that I bring in a urine sample. I was puzzled, but I did as it asked. When I arrived, the nurse was equally confused, but seeing as I had the sample with me, she decided there was no reason not to check it out. When she tested it for sugar, it came back as a strong positive. Suddenly concerned, she insisted on taking some blood. When the results came back from the laboratory a few days later, they showed that my blood sugar level was significantly elevated. After some confirmatory tests over the next few months, the diagnosis was clear. I had diabetes too. Lucky me. At only 19 years old, this came as a shock. I quickly learned why my colleague at the bookshop only a few years before had found the experience so difficult. Insulin therapy involves a great deal more than just doing injections, though they too took some time to acclimatize to. Much more challenging was what it did to my sense of self. Before my diagnosis, I enjoyed going on long hikes through the wilderness. Sometimes I would camp in remote spots, miles from the nearest town. Doing so gave me a feeling of independence that was lacking in the rest of my life. In a naive way, typical of adolescence, I liked to imagine that I could, should the situation demand it, be self-sufficient. The idea that I could ever have lived off the land was, of course, pure fantasy. Nonetheless, the idea that I might was, at that time, an important part of my self-image and identity. Diabetes, however, seemed to make this laughable. I now had to carry insulin and other equipment, and my doctors had explained how important it was to keep my blood sugar levels as stable as possible. If I did not, I might develop serious complications down the line, and in the short term might pass out, or even go into a potentially life-threatening coma. This all seemed challenging enough to deal with at home, let alone on some rainy hillside in the Lake District. More importantly, I was now completely reliant upon a pharmaceutical product, and the healthcare infrastructure that provided it. Even a few days without access to insulin could, I was told, prove fatal. Any notion that I might somehow be capable of surviving in the wild for weeks, months, or longer now seemed absurd. In short, diabetes threatened the very core of my being by stripping away part of my identity and replacing it with something that was, somehow, not me. If the things that made me recognize myself were gone, then who was I? That, especially for someone so young, was not an easy question to answer. When, years later, I read Australian novelist Peter Corris's memoir of his life using insulin, I immediately recognized the same anxiety. Imagining people with diabetes as weak and impotent, Corris rebelled against his diagnosis for much of his early life. The subjective meaning he attributed to his condition made him reject the label as he struggled to reassert his sense of identity in light of his diagnosis. This process of reconstitution in light of illness has been described as biographical work by scholars. When someone is diagnosed with a chronic disease, their original self is synthesized with the challenges and expectations, both biological and otherwise, implied by their condition. People need not become their diagnosis, as some worry they might, but it will inevitably transform them into something new, one way or another. Corris, for example, took up smoking and drinking heavily in an effort to push his condition away, but that rebelliousness was, in itself, a product of it. This interpretation made me reevaluate my experience. Diabetes forced me to engage in biographical work, certainly, but I had come to understand that my early belief, that something had been taken, was flawed. There is little that I absolutely cannot do, only more risk factors to acknowledge. Whenever I choose to do something, I must consider how it might affect my blood sugar and decide whether or not to proceed based on my own subjective priority. A diagnosis of diabetes does not threaten the self. Rather, it reveals it. Insulin therapy is, currently, a lifelong treatment. It insists that those undergoing it refine their personal value systems on a daily basis. They cannot stay passive because it is they who must do the business of treatment every day, incorporating it into their lives as a whole. Sometimes they may choose to do so as healthcare professionals recommend, other times in ways that they would not approve of. In either case, insulin illustrates their rich subjective world. If anything, it reifies the humanity of those with diabetes in all of its complexity and messiness. This is also, however, a distinctly political substance. Today, it has never been more so. Many of those who need it, like me, need it absolutely. Without it, they simply die, and too often they are allowed to. Insulin can tell us a great deal about the individual, but it reveals as much about the collective subjectivities of our societies and the ideological frameworks that sustain them. Insulin saved my life. Over the last decade and a half, I have become rather well acquainted with it. This subject is, as a result, very personal to me, as I am sure it is to countless others. That will be reflected in the following, and I make no claims to neutrality. Quite the opposite, in fact. In any case, its 100-year story is fascinating in its own right, and should be of interest to all of us, familiar with diabetes or not. Introduction. What is insulin, and why does it matter? In 1892, the British Medical Journal, BMJ, published a sobering account of diabetes mellitus in a boy of 10. The child, referred to only by his initials, JAC, had been admitted to St. Thomas's Hospital in London after complaining of dryness of the throat and mouth, of being very thirsty, troubled with cough, and of passing more water than natural, and also, though eating heartily, growing thin. When he was examined, the flushed, anxious-looking boy's urine gave immediate evidence of abundance of sugar. House physician Wilford Watkins Pitchford considered the situation grave. He immediately placed his patient on a limited diet of milk, water, eggs, green vegetables, and biscuits, and ordered that he be given morphine every 3 hours. The treatment, however, did little. JAC deteriorated rapidly. Over the following 24 hours, he produced a full 10 pints of urine, passing it with great regularity every hour of the day and night. 3 days later, his condition had worsened significantly. His emaciation had become extreme, and he had begun to hyperventilate and vomit. By the evening, the doctors considered him evidently moribund. He no longer asked for water, and, while still apparently conscious, had not strength enough to speak. He died the following day. Cases like that of JAC were particularly traumatic before the 20th century. Not only did they often involve otherwise healthy children and adolescents, but those affected usually died a miserable death. To make matters worse, no one could explain what was happening to them with any conviction. JAC was almost certainly experiencing what we would now call diabetic ketoacidosis, DKA. Today, he would almost certainly have been given insulin immediately, and there is a good chance that he might have survived to tell the tale. In 1892, however, this was not an option. Insulin and diabetes. So what exactly is insulin, this incredible substance that might have saved JAC's life? Today, it is thought of primarily as a pharmaceutical product, but it is not a drug in the same sense as, say, an antibiotic. Instead, it is a hormone, something that we all need to live, and which most of us make for ourselves. Cells found in the islets of Langerhans within the pancreas pump it out as necessary throughout our lives, and it plays an important role in ensuring that we are able to use the energy that we get from food. When we eat carbohydrates, they are broken down into sugars. When this enters the bloodstream, insulin is the substance responsible for making sure that it gets into our cells, which then burn it as fuel. In simple terms, it acts as a key, prompting our bodies to consume what they need to function. However, in some, like JAC, the insulin-producing islet cells stop working. This happens when a body's immune system mistakenly identifies them as a threat and attacks, impairing their function and eventually stopping it altogether. It is still unclear what exactly triggers this, and while such cases were historically associated with younger and thinner people, it can happen to anyone. With insufficient insulin, the body's cells are unable to absorb enough energy, and with nowhere to go, sugar begins to build up in the blood. As less insulin is produced, the energy deficit grows. After a point, this produces physical symptoms. People affected feel the need to go to the toilet more often as excess sugar is removed via the urine. This leads to dehydration and a persistent thirst that cannot be quenched. Symptoms continue to intensify until the amount of insulin being made is no longer enough to meet even basic requirements. At this point, the body's cells begin to effectively starve, and exhaustion sets in. Protein and fat tissues are broken down to function as an emergency energy source, and visible wasting begins to occur, sometimes over an alarmingly short period of time. Breaking down these alternative tissues floods the blood with ketones, increasing its acidity and producing a characteristic smell of acetone on the breath. Before long, this leads to DKA, which can be extremely dangerous. It can cause vomiting, stomach pain, breathing difficulties, and disorientation, and, left unchecked, often ends in coma and death. Without insulin treatment, this process is universally fatal. The exact prognosis varies as the islet cells are destroyed only gradually, but absolute insulin deficiency leads to death within a matter of days. By the time serious symptoms begin to occur, a considerable amount of damage has already been done. Before insulin, it was rare for anyone to survive beyond a few years following diagnosis. Today, we would describe this condition as type 1 diabetes mellitus, T1DM. However, this terminology is not particularly old. Before the 20th century, and for some time into it, diabetes was often considered a singular condition, and cases were distinguished only by symptomatic intensity. If they made a distinction at all, physicians generally referred to T1DM as severe, juvenile, or later, insulin-dependent diabetes. The language we now use was adopted widely only after 1979, following the publication of an influential paper by the USA's National Diabetes Data Group, NDDG. This suggested that diabetes be understood not as one condition, but as a genetically and clinically heterogeneous group of disorders that share glucose intolerance in common. While severe cases of diabetes seemed uniformly deadly, it had always been obvious that some people seemed to be affected more violently than others. Even as JAC died, others, most of them older and/or larger, avoided such a rapid downwards trajectory. Some even survived for years or longer with relatively manageable intermittent symptoms. In 1840, for example, English doctor C.R. Brie described the case of one 53-year-old man who had come to him in July 1835 complaining of great weakness. He was not emaciated, but he was passing 12 to 15 pints of sweet urine daily, had a great appetite, and could not quench his thirst. Brie recommended a few dietary adjustments, and, by the beginning of August, the man felt much better. His symptoms had not disappeared completely, but they had become tolerable, and he lived for another 3 years before dying of dropsy. Brie's account almost certainly describes what we would now call type 2 diabetes mellitus, T2DM. Like T1DM, this is a complex condition with no single cause. Age and obesity are considered well-established risk factors for developing it, but they are far from the whole story, and it too can affect anyone. Olympic gold medal-winning rower Steve Redgrave, for example, was diagnosed with T2DM at only 35, despite being a world-class athlete in active training. People who develop T2DM continue to make insulin, though their islet cells do sometimes show evidence of deterioration. The destructive autoimmune response present in T1DM is absent. Instead, this condition is characterized by insulin resistance. In those affected, the islet cells continue to function, but the insulin they make is far less effective at doing its job. Enough sugar is usually processed to meet basic needs, but much is wasted, and it begins to accumulate in the blood. Minor insulin resistance is often completely asymptomatic, but once blood sugar becomes sufficiently elevated, it does become noticeable. As the body flushes the excess sugar through the urine, thirst and dehydration develop, and as a significant amount of energy finds its way into a toilet bowl before it can be used, this is often accompanied by lethargy and sometimes weight loss. Because insulin, albeit not enough of it, is present in people with T2DM, they are not usually as susceptible to DKA, though it can occur. However, their condition is not benign. In addition to the uncomfortable, frustrating, and sometimes socially embarrassing symptoms, persistently high blood sugar levels can be devastating to the fabric of the body. People with untreated T2DM are significantly more likely to develop both heart and kidney disease, suffer strokes, and lose their sight. They also sometimes experience painful nerve damage and sexual problems, such as erectile dysfunction, while miscarriages during pregnancy are more common. Lifestyle changes can, in some cases, act to restore sensitivity to the body's own supply of insulin in cases of T2DM, and pills like metformin can help further, but this is not always sufficient to keep blood sugar beneath the threshold at which damage might occur. While it is not so immediately essential to life itself, injected insulin can play a vitally important role in maintaining health in such cases. Insulin has been available as a medication since 1922, but it has not trivialized diabetes. As pediatrician and historian Chris Feutner puts it, its introduction to medical practice was akin to a Greek myth of rebirth turned ironic and macabre. It does not permanently cure anything. It only replaces, or in the case of T2DM, supplements something usually made by the body. As a result, those who need it must take it for life. Complicating things further, insulin is not fire-and-forget medication, like, for example, an aspirin. If it is not taken in the right amount and at appropriate times to balance out demand, blood sugar levels can rise or fall to dangerous levels. Too much insulin in the body can lead to hypoglycemia, low blood sugar, which in extreme cases can cause unconsciousness and even death. Too little, and sugar levels become dangerously elevated, damaging the organs, nerves, and blood vessels, and, left unchecked, perhaps even leading to DKA. Insulin has, however, transformed the experience of diabetes. Those who are able to access it are given a reprieve that their predecessors were not. Long-term therapy, however, brings its own challenges, some of them very demanding indeed. But we are getting a little ahead of ourselves. It is impossible to discuss the history of insulin as a pharmaceutical tool without first considering the circumstances that led to its discovery. A very short history of diabetes before insulin. While it has been given a variety of names throughout history, diabetes is likely ancient. The term itself was first used by the classical Greeks and is derived from their word for siphon or to pass through, reflecting the huge amount of urine produced by those affected. Mellitus, Latin for sweet like honey, was later appended to indicate the characteristic abundance of sugar that it contained. Serious illnesses with symptoms paralleling those experienced by JAC in late 19th century Britain have been described across cultural boundaries throughout recorded history. The Ebers Papyrus, an Egyptian document dated to around 1552 BC, contains reference, albeit quite vague, to urine which is too plentiful. Ayurvedic texts from the Indian subcontinent are more precise, identifying madhumeha, honey urine, as a dangerous condition characterized by the passage of great quantities of sweet urine, unquenchable thirst, and bad breath. In imperial China, zaoke, wasting thirst, was associated with frequent urination, extreme thirst and hunger, and rapid weight loss well over 2,000 years ago. The most complete and likely most cited classical account comes from the 2nd century Greek physician Aretaeus of Cappadocia, who practiced in what is now eastern Turkey. Describing the symptoms and progress of those affected in excruciating detail, he wrote that the patients never stop making water, but the flow is incessant, as if from the opening of aqueducts. The patient is short-lived, if the constitution of the disease be completely established, for the melting is rapid, the death speedy. Moreover, life is disgusting and painful, thirst unquenchable. These old accounts are often incomplete and fragmentary, but the key elements remain strikingly consistent across vastly disparate societies and time periods. Most early accounts of diabetes appear to describe T1DM. This is not surprising. Such cases were rare enough to be notable. Aretaeus thought the condition not very frequent among men, while the intensity of symptoms made them difficult to ignore. In 1679, however, Thomas Willis, court physician to Charles I, argued in his posthumously published Pharmaceuticae Rationalis that diabetes had become considerably more prevalent than it had once been. Apparently something of a trendsetter, Willis blamed this squarely on overindulgence. The diabetes was a disease so rare among the ancients that many famous physicians have not so much as mentioned it, and Galen never knew above 2 that were troubled with it. But in our age, that is given so much to drinking and especially to guzzling of strong wine, we meet with very frequent, not to say daily examples and instances of this distemper. Willis believed that diabetes could effectively be controlled, writing that this disease at first beginning is oftentimes easily cured, but when grown strong in a man, very seldom and with great difficulty. He gives the example of one noble earl in the very vigour of his age, whose symptoms were successfully eased following treatment. He became much inclined to excessive urination, and when, for several months, he had been used ever now and then to make great quantities of water, he at last, it seemed, fell into a diabetes that was obstinate and strong, and almost desperate. For besides that in the space of 24 hours, he voided almost 1.5 gallons of limpid, clear, and wonderfully sweet water, that tasted as if it had been mixed with honey. He was likewise troubled with an extraordinary thirst, and, as it were, an hectic fever, with a mighty languishing of his spirits, weakness in his limbs, and consumption of his whole body. After being given several plant-based remedies and placed on a restricted diet, the Earl gradually recovered. Within a month he was almost quite well. His urine no longer tasted of sugar, and it did not much exceed the quantity of that liquid matter which he took in. Eventually, after recovering his usual tenure of spirits and strength, he returned to his former diet. Tellingly, his symptoms returned intermittently for the remainder of his life. But yet the disposition to this distemper did not so totally leave him, but that afterwards, oftentimes, through disorders in his diet and perhaps irregularities in the seasons of the year, being inclined to a relapse, he made water at first in great quantities, and then clear and sweet, with thirstiness, feverishness, and languishment of his spirits. This certainly does not seem to reflect the terminal condition described by Areteus and other early writers. Willis was an extraordinarily successful physician, whose wealth and status meant that most of his patients came from the elite ranks of Stuart society. As he explicitly pointed out, this demographic was not known for its temperance, and obesity was not uncommon. Moving in these circles, it is very likely that the majority of Willis's cases involved T2DM. Willis's powerful patients in the mid-1600s were a small minority unrepresentative of the general population of Britain. However, by the 19th century, most physicians did tend to agree that diabetes had become commonplace. Many echoed his claim that it was a disease of affluence, and most of those seeking treatment in this period certainly did come from the more prosperous sections of society. At the same time, others were beginning to highlight that it seemed to have become significantly more survivable than most historical accounts suggested it should be. In 1866, Scottish physician George Harley wrote that, "At one time when a patient was said to have diabetes, it was considered tantamount to saying his days were numbered. As our knowledge has increased, however, we have learned that, although it is but seldom possible for us to eradicate the disease, we can, nevertheless, so mitigate its effects as not only to prolong the life of the individual, but to render it a tolerable, if not even an agreeable one." Harley, like many of his contemporaries, was eager to credit the effort of the medical profession with any apparent improvement in prognosis. But it is quite likely that he was actually just observing the consequences of broad demographic changes within Victorian society. Thanks to the Industrial Revolution and the global hegemony of Britain's vast colonial empire, by 1866 there were considerably more people in the UK that would, today, be considered at high risk of T2DM than there had been 100 years before. The medical profession did have some success at ameliorating the symptoms of these new patients. In 1797, John Rollo, then Surgeon General of the Royal Artillery, outlined a low-carbohydrate, high-fat, animal food diet that appeared to have some positive effect. One 57-year-old general officer under his care, for example, had been diagnosed with diabetes approximately 3 years prior and regularly produced 10 or 12 pints of sweet urine in 24 hours. When consulted, Rollo advised him to adopt a heavily restricted diet that sounds singularly unappetizing: blood pudding for lunch, game and old meats which have been long kept, and as far as the stomach may bear, fat and rancid old meats for dinner, and bread and butter for both breakfast and supper, washed down with a mixture of milk and lime water. Impressively, the man soon did seem to improve. After some time on Rollo's diet, he was no longer so thirsty, and he was passing between 2 and 4 pints of urine daily. He even appeared to be regaining his strength. Following his apparent recovery, the officer in question, who had very great impatience under restriction, returned home to Portsmouth. After receiving permission from another physician to eat what he pleased and to drink wine, following a bowel complaint, his diabetic symptoms soon returned. Rollo, with some justification, took this as vindication for his approach to treatment. Rollo's restricted diet was highly influential, and while other physicians tinkered somewhat with the formula, most maintained the principle that diabetes was best treated by proportionally reducing carbohydrate in favor of greater quantities of meat and fat. This method of treatment remained common into the 20th century, probably because it did, on at least some occasions, seem to work, particularly for those we would now recognize as having T2DM. Nonetheless, no treatment could do anything for severe cases who continued to die quickly. By the middle of the 19th century, the stark differences in outcomes between people diagnosed with diabetes prompted some speculation that at least 2 distinct conditions might be responsible. In 1863, Manchester physician Daniel Noble, for example, asked whether it might be possible to establish pathological distinctions in cases of diabetes according to their origin, the course of the symptoms, and their curability. In 1866, George Harley had, correctly, surmised that saccharine urine is not itself a disease, but merely the most prominent sign of a variety of morbid actions. He distinguished between diabetes he thought was caused by excessive formation on one hand and by defective assimilation on the other. In those resulting from excessive formation, the patient is not necessarily emaciated and weak. He may, on the contrary, look both fat and ruddy, appearing, in fact, to be the very bloom of health. In this class of patients, it is not until the disease has made considerable inroads on the constitution that there is any marked emaciation. In the second class of cases, on the other hand, namely those resulting from defective assimilation, emaciation is one of the earliest and most prominent symptoms, the loss of the flesh being often very marked before the nature of the disease is detected. Harley's descriptions quite clearly reflect T2DM and T1DM respectively, but his theory was entirely speculative. He was only one voice amongst many, and throughout the 19th century, doctors came to very little agreement as they sought to explain the root cause of diabetic symptoms and draw lines between different types of the condition, if they believed any such division could be made at all. One major barrier to any real consensus about what exactly diabetes was and why some people seemed to be far sicker than others was the ambiguity of its origin. Until the late 19th century, physicians argued at length about where to locate its seat in the body. By the late 19th century, the pancreas had, correctly, been implicated several times, for example, by French physician Etienne Lancereau, but an undeniable link remained elusive. This changed in 1889 when German physicians Oskar Minkowski and Joseph von Mehring removed the pancreas of one of their experimental dogs for study. Following this procedure, they later reported, the animal had begun to relieve itself uncontrollably all over the laboratory floor and had died soon after. On examination, its urine was found to be full of sugar. It appeared to have spontaneously developed the kind of quickly fatal symptoms seen only in the most severe cases of diabetes, though precisely why, neither could say for sure. The concept of an insulin-like substance, in the very broad sense, can probably be traced to French Mauritian physiologist Charles-Édouard Brown-Séquard. From the mid-19th century, Brown-Sequard argued that various glands throughout the body produced internal secretions, that each played an essential role in maintaining health. Building on this, he later went on to suggest that, if extracted, they might have therapeutic value. His ideas were controversial at first, and his belief that injections of bull semen might rejuvenate old men who had long since lost their strength and virility was predictably mocked by his peers. But in principle, he was correct. He had, in fact, identified the group of substances University College London's Ernest Starling would, in 1905, give the collective name hormones. By the mid-1890s, Brown-Sequard's theory had become widely influential. One reason for this was that the work of other researchers seemed to lend it clear support. Minkowski and von Mehring's experience, for example, had, after all, shown that, without a pancreas, dogs would become sick and die in short order. In 1891, the idea gained even further traction when George Redmayne Murray reported that he had been able to successfully treat a woman with myxedema, advanced hypothyroidism, by injecting her with extracts from the thyroid glands of a sheep. Murray's success prompted a great deal of optimism amongst the medical community, particularly when it became apparent that the extract could be given orally without issue. By 1893, Brown-Sequard clearly considered his ideas thoroughly vindicated, highlighting diabetes as one example of a condition he thought would, like myxedema, benefit from treatment with organ extracts. "There cannot be a doubt now," he claimed, "that the pancreas, like the testicles, the ovaries, and the kidneys, has an internal secretion which is even more important than its external one, i.e., digestive fluids." He was, of course, correct, and was describing the hormone Belgian Jean de Meyer would christen insulin in 1909. However, initial attempts to use pancreatic extract were not promising. While he defended his internal secretion theory, Brown-Sequard was forced to concede that, while injections of the pancreatic liquid have been useful, no case of cure, to my knowledge, has been recorded. By the end of the 19th century, growing attention to the internal secretion of the pancreas discouraged many physicians from believing that multiple varieties of diabetes existed. In 1896, for example, Canadian physician William Osler suggested that, while both acute and chronic forms existed, there was no essential difference between them, except that in the former, the patients are younger, the course more rapid, and the emaciation more marked. By 1919, New York's Frederick Allen, widely acknowledged as one of the foremost global specialists on diabetes, felt comfortable arguing that it was one thing and one thing alone, a condition resulting from a deficiency of the internal secretion of the islands of Langerhans. He had little time for those who continued to suggest otherwise, brusquely dismissing the work of Lassereau, for example, as generally discredited. The status of the islet cells in the pancreas as the seat of the specific diabetic disturbance, he declared, is now as firmly established as any fact in physiology or pathology. Allen believed that high blood sugar was more than an indicator that the pancreas was producing insufficient internal secretion. He also thought that it could make things worse by overworking the islet cells, and, in doing so, causing them to degenerate further. The greater the burden placed on the organ, he argued, the more rapid the process would be. A mild case would, left unchecked, always become a severe one, and a severe one would eventually become terminal. While he understood diabetes as a singular condition, Allen did recognize that, cruelly, children seem to develop life-threatening symptoms more rapidly than their older counterparts, insisting that every case in a child calls for the most careful treatment from the earliest possible moment. As his longtime ally Elliot Jocelyn wrote in 1916, however, the melancholy fact was that where diabetes appears in its most severe type, as in children, coma is its expression. By the 1920s, Allen had become well known for his radical approach to dietary treatment. If deterioration was caused by undue pressure on the islet cells, he thought, then normalizing blood sugar through nutritional restriction would reduce the stress and stall the progression of diabetes. Dietary regulation was, by this point, nothing new, but Allen deviated from his predecessors by advocating a particularly aggressive strategy and claimed that remaining consistently underweight was beneficial. His method involved, to put it mildly, radical undernutrition. Where those undergoing treatment in the 19th century might have complained about being asked to cut bread, wine, and sweet foods from their diets, their prescriptions would have looked positively indulgent to Allen, who not only demanded drastically reduced carbohydrate intake, but substantially less food altogether. It is not at all surprising that Allen's strategy was pejoratively referred to as the starvation diet, or that the name stuck. While his exact prescription was tailored to each individual, patients at New York's Rockefeller Institute, where Allen worked from 1913, were often subject to extreme nutritional restriction, alongside periods of almost total deprivation, particularly if they were young and/or admitted with serious symptoms. One 13-year-old boy, for example, was hospitalized with shortness of breath and disorientation on the 12th of February 1917 and was quickly found to have extremely sugary urine. On his first day of admission, he was given only 20 milliliters of soup, which was increased to 60 milliliters, plus 40 milliliters of coffee, for the next 4 days. Following this period of fasting, he was moved on to a standard diet, which still only amounted to 240 calories daily for around 2 weeks. Unsurprisingly, Allen was not popular amongst his patients. In addition to his harsh approach to treatment, he was every inch the stereotype of the paternalistic early 20th century physician, a severe, humorless man who valued hard work, temperance, and discipline above all else. Combined with an absolute faith in his own style of diabetes management, he held a palpable contempt for those who breached his rules. As far as Allen was concerned, insubordination was one of the primary causes of death in those under his care. He separated fatalities into 2 groups, those attributed to disobedience of patient and those in which failure of treatment was responsible. He viewed the moral character of those under his care as an integral part of management, and felt that those who failed in their duty brought disaster upon themselves. The patients who died from breaking diet were not driven to desperation by hunger or suffering. They were generally not the ones who had to endure the greatest privations. They were, rather, the ignorant, the careless, the weak-willed, the neuropathic, and others who would not have been faithful to any restrictions, no matter how mild. It is difficult to imagine how oppressive this must have made life on the wards, but Allen's case records give some indication as to the kind of environment his patients endured while accommodated at the Rockefeller, particularly if he decided that they were, for whatever reason, lazy or untrustworthy. In one case, when he could not explain a barely perceptible resurgence of sugar in the urine of one visually impaired and bedridden 12-year-old, he interrogated the boy, who eventually admitted to breaking his diet. It had seemed that a blind boy, isolated in a hospital room and so weak that he could scarcely leave his bed, would not be able to obtain food surreptitiously when only trustworthy persons were admitted. It turned out that his supposed helplessness was the very thing that gave him opportunities which other persons lacked. The attempt to evade the strict watch kept over him appealed to him as a sort of game or battle of wits, so that he even took things for which he had no real desire. The boy, who had been given fewer than 700 calories daily for almost a week, and on some days considerably less, had been eating toothpaste and birdseed, the latter being obtained from the cage of a canary which he had asked for. Alan did not consider that this behavior might reflect the desperation of an unbearably hungry child, unwilling to openly challenge his doctor's instruction, and appears instead to have concluded that the whole episode was some kind of infantile game. Despite all of this, he did not lack for prospective clients. This speaks to quite how hopeless severe cases of diabetes must have seemed. Why else would anyone have subjected themselves or their loved ones to this kind of ordeal? The response amongst the medical community was also enthusiastic. By the First World War, Alan had become highly influential on both sides of the Atlantic. In 1917, British physician Otto Layton eagerly endorsed his method, which he described as the modern treatment of diabetes mellitus. George Graham used a similar approach at London's St Bartholomew's Hospital in 1921, making it even more onerous by insisting his patients remain in bed for most of the day. He justified this by suggesting that it might make dietary restriction more bearable, but also admitted that it was first implemented to ensure that his staff could keep close tabs on them. It is difficult to accurately assess how effective this harsh treatment was. We do know that of 44 patients under Alan's care at the Rockefeller in 1915, not all of whom will have had T1DM, almost half were dead by the end of 1917. Some had died of complications related to diabetes. Others simply starved. Even Alan admitted that it could only delay, not prevent the inevitable. When, years later, one physician described early 20th century treatment as little more than a counsel of desperation, the assessment seemed little exaggeration. One of Alan's most famous patients was a young girl called Elizabeth Hughes. Hughes had been diagnosed with diabetes in 1918 at the age of 11, and she came under his care a few months later, in early 1919. She was placed on a diet typical of Alan's practice, 889 calories per day. While she personally did not, with some justification, much enjoy the doctor's company, Alan considered her a model patient. As her health waned, she continued to abide strictly by her prescribed treatment. Nonetheless, few expected her to live into adulthood. Even Alan must have been pessimistic, and his stated mission to wring as much life out of his patients as possible in the hope that they might live long enough to see a cure must have seemed cold comfort. Final attention must again be called to the limitations inherent in every dietetic treatment. It affords only rest of a weakened function when a stimulus is often needed. Essential progress must take the direction of supplementing the negative and passive therapy with a positive and active force. The knowledge of diabetes is advancing rapidly enough that even the patient whose outlook seems darkest should take courage to remain alive in the hope of treatment that can be called curative. In the early months of 1922, however, it seemed that just such a positive and active force might finally be within reach. Promising news had begun to arrive from Canada. A team of researchers in Toronto, led by Frederick Banting, claimed to have successfully produced an effective pancreatic extract that could stop diabetes in its tracks. The substance, insulin, seemed almost miraculous. It appeared to have brought those children it was tested on back from the very brink of death. As the daughter of veteran American politician Charles Evans Hughes, a former governor of New York who had only narrowly lost to Woodrow Wilson as the Republican nominee in the 1916 presidential election, Elizabeth was as well cared for as any child of her era could have hoped to have been. She was able to rest in comfortable surroundings and was attended to daily by a private nurse. By the summer of 1922, however, she was in increasingly poor health. Horrendously emaciated, she weighed only 40 pounds, 18 kilograms, and was so exhausted that she struggled to walk. However, she was fortunate to be born into such a high-status family. After repeated requests by her parents, Banting agreed to take her on as a private patient. Hughes travelled to Toronto to receive her first injections of insulin in August, and afterwards recovered quickly. The sugar in her urine disappeared, and within a fortnight, Banting was allowing her a diet of around 2,500 calories per day, leaving the starved girl overwhelmed with relief. At the end of September, she wrote elatedly to her parents, "As you know, I am simply bursting to see you, and can hardly wait for you to actually see with your own eyes what I'm eating nowadays. For if you didn't, I declare you'd think it was a fairy tale. I know you will hardly know me as your weak, thin daughter, for I look entirely different, everybody says, and I can even see it myself." Hughes soon left the hospital and ended up living into her 70s. Within a matter of weeks, she appeared to have recovered almost completely, with little to show for her ordeal. Insulin seemed an almost unbelievable achievement, and 100 years later, this still seems a fair assessment. To date, it has saved countless lives, and, should we let it, it will save countless more.